fifth grade. Really ain't no difference if that nigga gay.
Blood satellite.
One thing I've been working on and picking away at for the past few months, and I always had it on the back burner, and I didn't really have an overall arc for what I wanted to do, but it's more about Canadian law. So I wanted to have a discussion and a segment about Canadian law, and I wanted to preface it by saying, I'm not a lawyer, so I guess you could skip this entirely if you want. Yeah. Well, in the sense that we are all lawyers, so yes. Everyone's a lawyer. And so in a sense, no one's a lawyer. So I guess in a way you should listen to this. Yeah. But I did a lot of reading. I was reading quite a few books just to give tips and tricks and maybe an overarching sentiment about Canadian law specifically. Now, of course, we have listeners from all over the world, a lot in Romania, interestingly, but in Eastern Europe.
We have more than one listener?
No, we have one listener in our chat, but we have I have the data of our international listeners.
Big in Romania, that's cool.
Big in Eastern Europe in general. So, and they're fun guys to talk to, and they all drive old cars from the 80s and stuff, but wear American cowboy hats. It's cool. But yeah, I read these books, and I read a couple specifically. One was just called The Constitution of Canada, and it's just a line-for-line breakdown of what they call the Canadian Constitution, explaining what that means. And there's another book. Hold on, let me grab them really quick. So two main sources here were Every Canadian's Guide to the Law. It's a pretty big book. It's around 600 pages. Then there's the Canadian Constitution by Adam Dodek, which is just very academic, very line for line. What does this actually mean? And then I also, buttressed this with a lot of us talking with a couple lawyers and just doing some general reading. So this isn't meant to be a lawyer's view on the law, which really what just to give people the context of this, what a lawyer is, what you want a lawyer to do is to help you navigate the law. And so you can know what the law is and how it works, but kind of like chess, you can know what chess is, you can know the rules of chess, but would you be willing to play a game against a chess grandmaster? No. So that's very much like the law. So you can be aware of the law. You can know the laws, you can know the history of the laws, but you would still want someone who is an expert in law or a lawyer to actually do this stuff. Mainly because this is a big problem. This is a problem that people have been talking about for a long time, that the entire legal system, the entire superstructure of politics is made by lawyers. Now, if there's one thing that I think every political side could probably agree with, is that that's bad. Not to say lawyers are evil, but what these people are masters of is making these labyrinthine logic constructs and kind of fogging the issue, and to the point where you need to be a master of it to interpret the law. That is actually a very bureaucratic system that works. Now, there's countries where that's not the case. There's countries where there's not so much of a bureaucracy. There's countries where there is a bureaucracy, but staffed with a different type of person. That's fine. But I think the fact that if you are in the West right now, the easiest track for you to become a politician is to become a lawyer. And it seems that most of the people in Parliament and Congress are lawyers, and I think that's fucked up and weird. All it is, you're very good at arguing. And if the entire legal system and the entire political system is just lawyers arguing, then it's really cut off to the rest of the people.
Yeah.
And you need to just pay substantial fee to even play the game. You can't play that game of chess. You need to hire a grandmaster.
There is a certain logic, first order logic to staffing the legislative branch of government with lawyers, because obviously they're responsible for creating the laws. You want people who understand laws, lawyers, to create laws. But the fact, I think it's just the nature of the way that democracy works. That's great. You're within the legislature and you're responsible for that, but you're also supposed to represent us. You're a representative. So if you are a lawyer and only a lawyer, then you're not a good leader. You're not a good representative. And I think that's like you're saying, that people on either side of the aisle would probably agree. In most cases, they would prefer somebody who's not a lawyer. It's not because they think that a non-lawyer would be better at legislating. They'd probably be worse. But there are so many other things that are being completely neglected in that decision-making process because the person's thinking like a fucking lawyer instead of like a person.
Yeah. And trying to find lawyers are very good at logic. And that's why if you, in Canada at least, if you are becoming a lawyer, you take the bar, I believe that's in Canada too, but you also take what's called the LSAT test. Now, there's ways around the LSAT test. We've known a couple people who couldn't pass the LSAT test and had to find a way around it. Anyway, but the LSAT test is close to an IQ test. What it does, it's all puzzles. It's all puzzles and taking if-then statements and things like that. So how to think abstractly about problems, even if it's in the phraseology of something. So that's kind of what it is. But really what I wanted to get to with this, in these books are interesting because, especially with Canada, so much of law is about setting precedents. And so much of it is about court decisions based on some judge. And this is relevant to Canada because our legal history is really low. If you go into like British legal history, you've got centuries. In Canada, it's like, this precedent was set in 1985. Like we didn't really have a law about most things until like after the 70s, which is interesting to think about. But what I wanted to get into people's heads about this is, even though despite everything I just said, you need a lawyer involved in this, in anything that happens. If you are a fan of this podcast, if you are in any sort of fringe political scene, understanding the laws of your nation or state or province or city is extremely relevant because odds are you will run up against them. Not for any crime you committed, really, nothing violent, but it might very well be the case that if you believe a certain thing or have said a certain thing or you are known to have a certain position, that could get you called in front of some kind of court or tribunal. So it's important to know what you can get in trouble for. And also I want to establish, this will sound kind of extreme, but I'll explain it more in detail. It's that there is no law in Canada as you know it. And when I say as you know it, I mean, for the average person, maybe even ourselves growing up, you think, well, there's the law. It's the law. It's the woman with the scales. It's justice. It's blind. We have these ancient ideas of right and wrong. And perhaps in the case of Britain, you can make a stronger argument for that. But in Canada, there isn't any of that. There is this sense that, and this is quoted in the books multiple times by different judges, and this is on the record, that Canadian law is a living tree. So what that means is it just grows and evolves over time, and it is supposed to grow and evolve. Whereas your average citizen might say, well, there's certain things that we built our nation on, and those never change. And America actually does have a lot of that. And if you were asking an American, they would be correct in saying there's certain things in our Constitution that are boulders that you can't move. And that's not to say people don't try and move them. That's where you get the Second Amendment and gun rights and things like that. They're trying to be moved. But there is more of a sense that these pillars are forever and you can't move them. And in Canada, those pillars don't exist. So keep that in mind. If you enter into the legal system, you might be thinking, at the end of the day, there's this thing called the law. It's going to defend me. No. It 100% comes down to the lawyer you have or the argument you're allowed to make, because this shit is very, very flexible. It's very, very easy to make you an enemy and to take the entire machinery of the state and use it against you if you have the right person making an argument to do so. And in these books specifically, they give you a lot of precedents in court cases where they decided, like, we're setting the standard based on this one judge. So like we were talking, I'm going to lead with this. Like we were talking about before, you're thinking that the law came from your ancestors. It came from this, again, a big machine, an ancient machine that you like. A lot of the times it comes down to a judge. And there is such a thing as an activist judge. There's actually a lot of them. There's a lot of judges at the highest level of law. You think of a judge, you think of the people who are supposed to be emotionally and psychologically beyond all of this, beyond the stuff that we debate about. They are vanguards of this thing called law. They're not. They're nihilistic just as much as anyone. They want their name in print just as much as anyone. They want to retire and spend time with their grandkids knowing that they got some landmark decision and their fucking name is on it. So they're not above making an example of you if they think that's going to get them in the history books. So remember that. And is it possible to get to these people? Now, it might be very difficult for you to change the law, for anyone to change the law, but you can get to a judge. You can get to a judge through their grandkids who are hectoring them about some fucking article they read. They're still people. It's not, and people will complain about that all the time. That even with the Rittenhouse trial, when Rittenhouse got off. But you know what? There is this sense, I think, that we got lucky there, and the evidence was
because of the judge.
It was insurmountable that he did the right thing. Now, if there was any little wiggle room on that, they might very well have got him. If it wasn't on camera, they might have got him on that. The fact that there was on camera and it was framed so perfectly, you know what I mean? Like if it was at a distance, that would work. Like just like the case of those black kids who kidnapped and tortured a autistic white guy on Facebook Live over the course of years. Like the only reason that became a big thing was because they had an extremely rare case of they showed their faces and his face and said to the camera, "Ha ha, we're torturing him." If it was anything less than that, it wouldn't have been news. So there is this idea with a lot of the cases that we won that it did come down to that judge at that time with that set of evidence. But if there was any wiggle room legally, we've either lost it or we've disappeared. And that kid, all these people would have been not even martyrs because we wouldn't have known about them. But so just to give you a brief overview here of the Constitution of Canada. We hear that brought up a lot. Regular people say Constitution of Canada. What actually is that? So first of all, Canada has no real constitution, as people are probably thinking of it. It's actually several documents, and they're always brought up for revision. You know, once a decade, sometimes they're brought for revision. So none of these are immutable laws. They're always open to let's update them as our attitudes change. So we have the British North America Act. This is going to sound like a civics class, but I promise I'll get past it. The British North America Act, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and the Bill of Rights. Now, all of these include documented and unspoken laws. And this is mentioned in these books, that there's unspoken laws. Now, and this is kind of making the argument that from the very beginning, Canada wasn't a real country. At the very beginning of the Charter on Rights and Freedoms, they say that the Charter is not absolute and it has reasonable limits. Quote, and that's a quote, reasonable limits. Now, what do reasonable limits mean? They don't describe that. And you'll notice that once you read the actual letter of the law in Canada, you'll see reasonable limits a lot. It's ill-defined. It's up to the judge at that time. They'll talk about things like what's in the best interest for the people. What does that mean? Well, that's up to them at the time. It's and they use the word reasonable a lot. So in Canada, for people, we actually don't have free speech like in America. And even free speech in America is a hotly debated topic. But even within our Constitution, our unified Constitution, it's a very long document, by the way. It's way longer than the American one, which is bad. Here's a little bit of law for people, because I used to work briefly at a law firm. This comes from contract law. So the rule is that if you're signing a contract at a job, the shorter the contract, the better. Because in Canada and in America and a lot of states, you have a lot of automatic rights unless you sign those rights away. So the longer the contract you're signing, odds are that in the fine print there, you're actually signing away some rights you otherwise might have. So keep that in mind. Some people are like, oh, it's just a boilerplate contract. That's good, because there's a lot of laws in Canada that actually benefit the employee unless you sign them away because you didn't read the fucking thing and you didn't know you had those rights to begin with. So when we look at the Canadian Constitution, it's very, very long. So you're thinking, oh no, that's a bad sign. So with freedom of speech right in there, they will say, we have freedom of speech within reason. You know, with what does that mean? You know, let's be sensible. What does that fucking mean? They don't know. That means it's flexible forever, because that means you don't need to change the law. You need to just maybe rejigger what reasonable means. You can do that with psychologists. You can do that with journalism. So at this point, you see how many inputs the legal system have from things outside of the legal system.
Yeah.
So the reasonable is never defined, and most things in Canada are subject to legislative override, except for Aboriginal stuff. Aboriginal laws like really set in stone. No one wants to move that. And like I said, the Constitution is seen as a living tree document. The language of the Constitution allows for infinite amendments. Like in America, an amendments to the Constitution is a big thing. This is just a matter of course. You can amend this thing. Like a lot of countries in South America could do that, and that's what they used to say was wrong with them. Like, oh yeah, every new dictatorship has a new constitution. Well, yeah. So then I guess they don't really matter, really. And the Supreme Court differentiates between formal equality and substantive equality. So when we talk about equality, there's actually two different types of equality. And this is kind of what I'm talking about, with them preferring substantive equality. So formal equality might be like, oh, men and women are equal. That's something that a lot of libertarians and such would agree on. But even judges, in their own word, prefer substantive equality, which means that whenever you're looking at a case, if you just don't like the story you're hearing, you can give a disproportionate sentencing. So from the very beginning, and they think that's more just, and that's what I'm trying to get to. Like, they don't think that's an error. That's not a bug. That's a feature. Saying that true equality, and this is kind of how our society has shifted over the years, true equality has to be on a case-by-case basis. They have to speak their truth, and it's that judge's decision to say whether that specific truth, not an overall truth, but a specific truth means that, well, maybe you deserve 10 more years in jail, or maybe you should pay $20,000 more because I like that story. See, so if you got a good story, you've got a direct line to a judge a lot of the time. It's not this thing called the law.
Yeah.
And so, and a lot of the other thing they do in this is they talk about the principles of fundamental justice, but they never define what fundamental justice is. And this has a really heavy bearing on abortion, prostitution, and things like that. So it ends up the decision of the Supreme Court to always define what sort of liberty is reasonable. So they'll appeal to, like, this fundamental justice. Well, what is that? Is that British justice? Is that weak justice? Is that, like, when I hear people say about ancient law, okay, what is that? Don't just assume we know it. And you'll also hear in the document, like, the Canadian spirit, the spirit of justice. The word spirit shows up way more than you think it would. So again, it's just this gas you're trying to grab. Like, the spirit of law, it's substantial. That's enough. That's not enough. Is this the spirit of what Canada is about? Well, has the spirit of Canada changed over 40 years? Even liberal activists would say yes, and they would see that as a job well done. So by gerrymandering what is reasonable, they've also gerrymandered the spirit of Canada. So that has a direct effect on the law, which has a direct effect on if you're going to end up in jail. So when people see these articles, they see a silly article published, like, oh, it's got a lot of views, it's clickbait. Well, who clicks them also is judges. Who also clicks them is lawyers. And in my brief time at the law firm, I was really amazed at the prevalence of activist lawyers. There's a lot of people who get into law just for activism, and then they'll pick, you'll hear about environmental law. Okay. But then there's also Aboriginal law. You get in it specifically to attack Canada, from a legal standpoint. So there's activist judges publishing articles in read a legal website. There's like abovethelaw.com is one. That was one I used to read, Above the Law. See how many activist type articles are written by fairly successful lawyers. And these are industry magazines. Who's reading industry magazines? Legal professionals. So that's the conversation they're having. And that's all I'm going to say about that. Like, who can actually change the law? It's not someone complaining to a judge. It's like lawyers who write articles for retarded judges who read them. So the bill, here's an interesting thing to look at it. The Bill of Rights applies to the Canadian government, but our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which was created by Pierre Elliott Trudeau, Justin Trudeau's father, kind of applies to all governments. And this was pursued unilaterally by Pierre Elliott Trudeau not long after he had led the vote against Quebec separation. So this idea of our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, it's like they're taking a universalist approach. So our Bill of Rights is just about Canadians. Everything else we do, and you'll notice Canada does this, is meant to be projecting to the world. Our Charter of Rights and Freedoms is about human rights. It's about human dignity, human liberty. So it applies to us because it has to, but this is what they're also trying to export to the UN. And Canada signed on to this like UN Charter of Rights and Freedoms. But that's what it is by design. Like it is this universalizing force projection thing to be like, here's how all governments should be run. Here's how we define liberty and how all humans should define liberty. So, if you want to see the world they want to make for everyone, is look at Canada. Do you like Canada? Do you like living here? Well, that's going to be everyone if they get their way. So keep that in mind. Here's another thing that I found really shocking. I had to look this up to see if it was true, but it is true. In the book, they described that the Charter of Rights and Freedoms was 100% created by activist groups in Canada. So what they did when they were drafting this Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which was within our lifetime, depending on who you are, this would have been like the 80s, they actually commissioned, like, what should we put in it? We're taking a poll. We're opening the phone lines to Canadians to figure out what the rights and freedoms should be. And who are those phone lines open to? Activist groups, Aboriginal activist groups, feminist activist groups, any, fucking Chinese billionaire activist groups, any activist group. What helped craft this thing that we all have to abide by. So just another way to look at the law is that it's not for people. It's not designed by people. You think it might have been at some point. No, it was designed by fucking activist groups of psychotic women, usually. By very, very angry Jewish women, made the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and then the Aboriginal people, they trotted out on leashes to be like, yeah, they agree with me, so you better do it. I'm not saying anything about Jews, but Jewish women, yes, okay, all right, let's be honest here. Yeah. It's not Larry David isn't on this, but it's fucking Susie from Curb Your Enthusiasm who did this, so you know what I mean.
Get the hell out of my house, you ingrate! You hurt Sammy! One more time, Larry! Get the fuck out of my house, okay? You squashed the spirit of a talented young girl! You piece of shit! You heartless piece of shit! Out!
So you're thinking, what do these activist groups do? Well, even if it's like a 5-person group and they got a website and they got a little office, well, they helped draft the Charter of Rights and Freedoms in Canada. So you might think they're a waste of time, but that's the power that they have had, and they still have that power. But really, that was who designed these laws, which I think should give people a fucking shake right now when they hear that. And over time, another thing you see in law, and you see this in the U.S., and which is why it's so dangerous, is you see provincial and states' rights get whittled away and more rights afforded to the federal government. So that's why your ability to escape this stuff is shrinking, because you might say, oh, I can escape to Alberta or Texas. Yeah, go ask Texas how that's doing now that California is flooding in. So even as a legal strategy, that's a bad thing, because you're just going to have a bunch of fucking nerdy queers in there in a few years anyway, just to stink up the joint. Now, here's a couple things that I would like to say to people who are entering into the legal system, maybe because they got in trouble for something. Here's things that I learned, and maybe they're out of date, but I don't think they are. This was all fairly recent, but I found them surprising. One, that the government does not need to provide state-funded counsel. So in America, like, you might have a public defender. Canada doesn't need to do that, And there actually is no right to remain silent during questioning. And a lot of people might trot that one out, like, I don't have to say anything to you. Well, there's actually no legal protection for you to shut up when talking to police. However, this is where it gets kind of crazy. However, those answers cannot be used to incriminate them in other proceedings. And this is where it gets foggy. So I don't know what that means. So you don't have a right to remain silent, but there are certain kind of moment by moment things where it can't be used against you. It's somewhat ill-defined. And if any lawyers listening who knows more about this, let me know. But this is what I was hearing from lawyers. Like, you actually, a lot of stuff you think you might say to cops, you can't do it, Just like the phone call. You don't get just one phone call. You can have as many phone calls as you want, but really they don't have to follow these rules. Now, here's the most important part in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, and this is where like I was saying before, the language is really against you. everyone is equal under the law. However, and this is written down very specifically, it does not preclude any law that treats people differently. Okay.
What?
So what they say,
What?
yes.
Why
Yes.
even write that? It's
So everyone's equal. However, there's no rule against having a law that benefits someone specifically. And they use the phrasing disadvantaged people. And
So
I don't need to explain what that is.
Everyone's equal except for the ones that aren't.
Yeah. And you're saying, oh, Dimes, this is you reading wrong. No, this is in there. And then they're open about this. They're open about, like, if you're disadvantaged, you deserve this. And so the spirit of the Canadian law, and I think the spirit of maybe what you can call a globalist law, you can call it a lot of different things. This is the law they want, is that Canadian law, the letter of Canadian law, is saying that we want to defend the rights of the individual. Okay. Now that might sound okay on the surface. Like we're making this big machine so that you're not taken advantage of. There's no predatory people. You as an individual are going to be safe, and we're going to stand up to the bullies. So a way to look at the law and the legal system is a big bully, but they're saying we'll bully the right types of people. Now, what that means is that there's no such thing as an overall truth. There is no larger argument to be made for, if you let this criminal get away, that will have ramifications that, helps other criminals. They don't see it that way. All they know is there's this case, there's this guy, and let's use a thief. A guy does a home invasion, and let's say no one died. Let's just say he's got a lot of theft on his record, no murders or anything, but they would say he came from a disadvantaged background, and they'll give him a lenient sentence. Now, you can very correctly make the argument that, okay, if we're doing this, then we're going to always let thieves go because all thieves are often poor. They don't steal because they're poor. There's just a correlation there, right? That's whatever. But if you keep doing this will have larger social ramifications. That it strikes at the idea that theft is wrong. A lot of law is supposed to take these big civilizational values and make sure each person is obeying them. They've inverted that by saying, what we're here is you're an individual in front of the court, and we're here to help you as much as we can. So we actually don't service any other larger civilizational goal, if you can think of it that way. So what that means is that, like, if that legitimizes theft, they don't care because they don't think in the abstract. They don't think that this is a civilization where everyone needs to follow the rules, because the rules as we have them are only designed to help people. This is why in Canada, if you're an Aboriginal and you're a gangbanger, they will say, we're not going to send you to jail, Canadian jail. We'll send you to an Aboriginal healing lodge because that's better for you. And you can say, wow, that's not really punishments. It doesn't matter. We're not here to punish people. Why do you want to punish people? We're here to rehabilitate individuals.
Tragic case of 8-year-old Tori Stafford was the main focus of question period today. Terry Lynn McClintock, who pled guilty to Stafford's murder in 2010, has been transferred from prison to an Indigenous healing lodge in Saskatchewan. The Conservatives were calling on the government to reverse that decision.
So, which again, to your average liberal sounds good. But if you drill down into what that means that there's no civilizational value anymore. And that's why, by some crazy coincidence, it seems that there's way more theft and violence now because we've actually made a plan to not serve these larger ideas. Okay, so that's letter of the law. So let me just go here. There's a couple other interesting things I found here that I'll just bring up. When they talk about public policy, when they talk about, judges, they have to serve public policy, which is political in a sense. And this is written down in the Every Canadian's Guide to the Law. So a lot of times when judges are sentencing, they'll say, does this serve public policy? What does that mean? Well, it's vague. We don't know. But does it seem right to you? So that's where sentencing comes in. But you can see now politicians are thinking like judges are thinking like politicians, which is, so we've discussed how the judges have inputs from the public to change their views and their sentencing. But now you also have judges thinking in the larger social context. And that's where you get judges thinking, if I send this black rapist to jail, how does that affect all black people? So that's not even from a disadvantaged group thing. That's just thinking like, how does my decision impact society? And these are also the people who want their decisions to impact society. So you have judges and lawyers who are just politicians. And so really there is no difference. I guess I'm trying to get it. There is no difference between a lawyer and a politician. Functionally. in this society. So don't think that the law, if politics isn't going to save you, the law sure as shit won't, because the law is just politics with more guns and bars attached to it. So, and there's one, we talked about this on an earlier episode, just to give you an idea of how kind of twisted up this bureaucratic law gets. Here's how abortion works in Canada. I'm not trying to get into a whole abortion thing, but so in short, when a woman is pregnant, they understand that the thing that's in their belly, in their womb, is an entity. It is a life, but it is not a person.
Some people say that abortion is permissible because a preborn child or fetus is not a person. So let's ask the question, what is a person? In everyday conversation, we use the terms person and human being to mean the same thing. I'm a person, you're a person, your parents are persons. Children, yours or somebody else's, are persons. Your dog might have a lot of personality, but your dog is not a person. Your car or computer, definitely not persons. But the terms human being and person do belong to different categories. Human being is mainly a biological term, whereas person is mainly a moral term, referring to an individual's value or rights.
And they delineate between those two things. And this is on record. So what this means is that, okay, if you're a pregnant woman and you get into a car accident because there's a drunk driver, guy driving drunk hits the car, and the baby survives, but the baby is born with a defect in their brain. And if they can prove that was because of that accident, they can sue that guy. So now because that means that person had rights while they were in the womb, right? So they made the connection biologically that this guy was a human, but not a person, because you're not a person until you're born. See what I'm saying? Now that's a very lawyer way of looking at it, and that's you get into a philosophical argument. They're like, what? That doesn't. So there's a human and a person has rights. A human doesn't. So can a person just become a human? Like, and this is where you get into biological stuff, where it's like, okay, if I'm in a coma, am I less of a person? Or the idea is that personhood is something that's granted by the law, whereas in other places, as long as you are a human, you're a human and you have rights. So you're the same person in a womb as outside of the womb. That's kind of the argument Americans get at. But we legally said, no, it's a baby, but who cares? So that means that's where they can make an argument. You can have an abortion 5 minutes before that baby is crowning. So if you're a fully formed baby in the womb and you're 10 minutes from getting delivered, they can choose to have an abortion, which means just stabbing a baby in the skull through the vagina. That's legal, and they will make that legal. I've had that argument with people. I've had that debate with Canadians who say, no, that is legal. It's in my body. I can choose to stick a knife in my vagina and stab it in the brain. And they'll say, well, it's not a person. Like, this is who you're dealing with. And this is in Canada. This isn't everywhere, but this is Canada. I have to get going soon, so I'm going to try and keep this quick. Another thing that I found, it's considering everything we just said, we talked about this before about how, there's the law, but the law traditionally didn't encroach upon your private life, usually in traditional societies and whatnot. But I found the case of common law marriage, them trying to do that. So traditionally, you would only have laws if you were married. There were certain laws that applied to you. Anything else is just kind of off the books. But there's this thing called common law marriage in Canada and elsewhere, but in Canada mainly, which means that you're technically married if you've been cohabitating with someone for 3 years, right? If you've been living with a girlfriend or boyfriend for 3 years, you are technically common law married, which means in the eyes of the law, you are married, so you can get spousal benefits if you break up. So for men, I'm not going to tell any tales out of school here by saying the legal system is targeted for women and against men. It's built to benefit women because they are a disadvantaged group. Right. But on a case by case basis, they can make up. If you've been living with a guy for 3 years, you're not married, and you can prove that you've become accustomed to a lifestyle. Even if you don't have a kid, you can get spousal support.
So I mentioned earlier that if you live together continuously for more than 3 years, it may crystallize a spousal support entitlement. If you're married, there's an automatic spousal support entitlement. But then the court analyzes the facts. You have to prove, firstly, that you're entitled to it on a number of bases. The second type of spousal support is called needs-based. You live together in a relationship of permanence or marriage, generally for a longer period of time. You lived a certain lifestyle, that accustomed standard of living test that you hear about. You separate. One of you earns $250,000 a year. One of you earns $25,000 a year. Nobody took any time off work to have kids. Everybody's working. Everybody's healthy. But there's a vast disparity in your incomes. That's a needs-based claim because you have a need to have more income in order to enjoy a standard of living similar to the standard of living you enjoyed during marriage or lengthy cohabitation. So you get support from the higher earning spouse just to bring you closer to the standard. It's not 50-50, it's not equal.
So if you've been living with a girlfriend who has a kid and you're not the kid's dad, you can still be on child support, even if she moved in with that kid already. Keep that in mind. Now, that is the law. That is the government trying to say, like, I know you're not married, you haven't done this ceremony, but, you know, what's right? What's right for her? What's right for and what's right for these groups is always going to be that you pay or you go to jail. And this comes down to, like, there's cases in these books where precedents were set where there's one case where, you know, the typical thing, a fucking store owner was following a black woman around the store because of shoplifting or whatever. She could actually sue him for discrimination, and they have to pay for humiliation. So if you feel humiliated or insulted or you feel embarrassed by something that happened, you can get paid $10,000. How do they calculate that? Well, that's up to the judge and what's reasonable. So now you've entered in the world of reasonable and you've entered the world of stories. So if you've been living with a bitch for 3 years and she cheated on you, because fidelity has nothing to do with why you can get a divorce, by the way. If she cheats on you, but they can prove that you provided a lot and she's kind of used to it, ding, 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 you got to pay her. Here's another rule you might not know. You don't necessarily stop spousal or child support when the child turns 18 or if the woman remarries. Usually it does, but they can make a solid case that even if a woman remarries, you still got to pay that bitch spousal support or alimony. Even if that kid turns 18, you know, they can make a case that they're going to school now. So maybe they're going maybe you got to pay them money till they're 25, maybe 35. It's what's reasonable and what's best for them on an individual basis. So keep that in mind. Keep that in mind when you go in front of a fucking judge. Also, let me see. There were cases where, like, a woman could basically kill her husband and make a case that was in self-defense, and then it's like, yeah, we'll believe that. Like, this could kill you. The best way to get a divorce, by the way, I learned, is to live apart for 1 year. That's pretty much the only way to get a divorce in Canada. So infidelity doesn't matter. If you committed adultery, they don't even recognize that. They basically state that marriage is just like a courtship ritual. So that's how they view marriage. They view it, it's just part of the dating game. So if you got strong views on marriage, well, the government doesn't agree with you. Just to circle back to what I made before, this is part of human and civil rights. Equal rights under Section 15 prohibit discrimination on the grounds of race, religion, national or ethnic origin, color, age, and mental or physical disability. Section 15 gives additional and a special protection to women because it is enhanced with an extra power of Section 28, which is Canada's Equal Rights Amendment. This protection means that even though there are limitations on the constitutional guarantees of fundamental freedoms, legal, democratic, mobility, and language rights expressed in other sections of the Charter, all rights and freedoms referred to are nevertheless guaranteed equally to men and women. So basically just saying there that you get special rights. So everyone's equal, but people get special rights. So keep an eye on what those special rights actually are. Little things like, if you're a smoker, you have fewer custody rights. So if you're going up with your husband or wife and you're a smoker, that matters to who gets custody. Little things like that. What's best for them, And just some little factoids. Until the 1950s, women could be exempt from jury duty because they were women. That's pretty funny. There is a law here where homosexual bigamy can be permitted. So there was a couple cases. I should be citing these. Let's see if I can cite them later if I do a clip. But it was about how this is where transgenderism gets weird. That, okay, if you have a mother and a father, and then the father is gay, right? He's still your father, but then that guy marries another man. You could have a mother and two dads. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So you could have like that. That's kind of introducing the idea that you could have multiple parents legally. So there's like the biological father, then there's like this other thing called a father. But why couldn't you have three mothers and two dads? Why couldn't you have a polyamorous situation? Now they got to this by arguing through homosexual rights and stuff. And what do we do with this transgender thing? You know, but on a case by case basis, this is how you end up having. You could have 5 gay dads.
Yeah.
That's fine, but marriage is still kind of between a man and a woman unless it's gay people involved. Then legally, it could be whatever the fuck you want it to be. And where does that fall legally? I don't know. We're making it up as we go along.
Yeah.
Anyway, so I guess that's just, I wanted to go through some of the basic stuff about how this stuff works and plant people's ideas of how fluid and flexible this all is. And what it really comes down to is your ability to argue and your ability to exert your will on the system. That is what changes laws, but that is also what defends you. And don't think for a second that you actually have these firm pillars of law. Because even the pillar of, rights and freedoms, what are rights? What are freedoms? We can amend them whenever the fuck we want. And we already do amend them to grant more rights and privileges to others. So keep that in your back pocket, not only if you're in Canada, but if you're in America. But really, the important thing is that they want this to happen globally as well.
Do not let the rapists win. Listen and love Blood Satellite.